The square is quiet now, but centuries ago, it would have been anything but. Imagine the cobblestones beneath your feet, worn smooth by the shuffle of fearful townsfolk. Torches flicker along timbered walls, casting long shadows. And there, in the center, stands a wooden contraption. A scaffold, a pillory, a rack, silent witnesses to humanity's most primal mixture of fear, power, and morality. This was public space turned theater of control. A place where rulers, magistrates, and sometimes neighbors asserted the invisible rules of society with the sharp edge of shame. History has a habit of disguising brutality as order. In medieval Europe, the line between justice and spectacle was thin, and morality was often enforced through methods that today make our skin crawl. The crime was never just the act. It was the message that needed sending. A lie, a theft, a scandalous word, or a defiant voice could all make you the target. And so the community gathered, not just to witness, but to participate in the ritual, to nod, gasp, or point, to remind themselves that deviation came at a price. Consider the pillory, a seemingly simple device, a wooden frame with holes for the hands and head, yet its simplicity belied its power. A man might be placed in the pillory for lying, cheating, or even insulting a town official. Once secured, he became a public canvas, open to ridicule, jeers, rotten vegetables, and worse. His body was immobilized, but his shame moved freely, rippling through the crowd. Women, especially, faced harsher scrutiny. Any act that hinted at impropriety, breaking a promise of marriage, gossip, or even failing to conform to expected modesty, could lead to exposure in the same pillory. Here, morality and control intertwined, shaping behavior through fear of public humiliation. The stocks, often confused with the pillory, served a similar purpose but immobilized the feet. Picture a cobblestone street ringed with townsfolk, merchants pausing in their daily trade to gawk at a local miscreant. They were often jeered at, mocked, sometimes pelted with refuse. But the underlying principle remained: shame was a weapon. It could be wielded without a blade, yet it cut just as deeply. Social status, gender, and perception all influenced the severity. Nobles might escape with a fine, while peasants endured hours of exposure under the unrelenting gaze of their neighbors. There were other, more elaborate devices too. The rack, the breaking wheel, and the stocks for immobilizing multiple offenders at once, each an instrument of both punishment and public demonstration. But unlike executions, these punishments did not necessarily end a life. They ended dignity, and often for extended periods. They forced the accused to experience firsthand the consequences of stepping outside societal norms. Pain and fear were secondary. Humiliation was the primary lesson. Communities thrived on these performances, and local authorities understood the psychological leverage it provided. Not every punishment was physical. In some towns, offenders were forced to wear signs or symbolic clothing. A shame mask could cover the face, carved with grotesque expressions, leaving only the eyes to plead. Women might be made to wear dresses marked with letters denoting their alleged sin. These markings were visual reminders of moral boundaries. Children watched, neighbors whispered, and the offender carried this public mark, sometimes for days, as a constant reminder of their deviation. In an era with limited literacy, symbols were as powerful as words. Interestingly, punishments often reflected societal anxieties. In towns where gossip and rumor could spread like wildfire, women who were outspoken or failed to conform to patriarchal expectations were frequent targets. Men too, particularly if they threatened the social order or challenged religious authority. The punishments were performative, and the performance was the deterrent. The goal was never only to correct the individual, but to remind everyone else of the invisible lines they were not meant to cross. And yet, amid the cruelty, these rituals reveal the medieval mind. A world where morality, community, and authority were inseparable, and where shame could be as terrifying as the rack. Even religious institutions participated. Clerics and moral authorities sanctioned public penances, where sinners were forced to walk barefoot through streets, carrying banners announcing their transgressions. One chronicler notes a woman forced to parade for weeks for spreading rumors that contradicted church teachings. The physical strain mattered less than the social exposure. Her offense was magnified by the community's gaze, transforming a private misstep into a spectacle designed to instill fear and obedience. This was social control at its most visible, a public lesson carved from humiliation. But the use of shame was not always consistent. Magistrates and clergy might show mercy, or the crowds themselves might intervene, either to amplify punishment or to temper it. This inconsistency could create fear and tension, a reminder that society's moral code was enforced by both rulers and peers. A person might be pilloried for minor theft one day and escape punishment for a graver misdeed another. The unpredictability itself reinforced obedience, keeping the community attuned to the invisible moral compass dictated by those in power. The psychological weight of these punishments was profound. Modern scholars note that shame can leave deeper scars than physical pain. In the medieval context, the fear of exposure, mockery, and social ostracism could influence behavior far more effectively than a sword or whip. People internalized the lesson. Step out of line, and your reputation, your very social identity, could be stripped away. And for women, whose social standing was often precarious, the stakes were especially high. The threat of public shaming reinforced not only moral codes but gender hierarchies, keeping entire segments of society in their prescribed roles. The shadow of the pillory and stocks stretched far beyond the town square. Within households, whispers of impropriety could trigger smaller, yet equally potent forms of punishment. A woman accused of gossip might be barred from church gatherings, shunned at markets, or denied social celebrations. The effects of shame were cumulative, extending through networks of family, neighbors, and acquaintances. Each glance or murmur reminded her of transgression, reinforcing societal control without the need for a single lash. Medieval justice was a mosaic of public and private enforcement, with morality coded into every interaction. One of the most striking devices for enforcing social norms was the scold's bridle, sometimes called the brank. Crafted from iron, it covered the head, with a gag that pressed down on the tongue, rendering speech impossible. This was rarely about physical harm. Instead, it was about silencing voices deemed dangerous or improper. Women were the primary targets, especially those labeled gossips or outspoken critics of male authority. To wear a scold's bridle in public was to become a living symbol of moral failure, a walking cautionary tale. Crowds would mock, point, and laugh, reinforcing the idea that certain voices had no place in society. The bridle embodied both gendered control and the terrifying power of public shaming. Punishments like these reveal how intertwined morality and law truly were. Medieval authorities did not merely punish acts, they punished the idea of disruption. Theft, adultery, or slander became acts that required communal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Public humiliation served as a moral broadcast, signaling acceptable behavior and warning those who might stray. Sometimes the punishments were designed to be theatrical, almost ritualistic. Town criers, drums, and the loud recitation of crimes accompanied offenders through streets. Every step was an orchestrated reminder. Society watches and it judges. But not all improper behavior was so easily categorized. Superstition, religious fervor, and cultural anxieties created gray areas where punishment and morality overlapped unpredictably. Women accused of witchcraft, for example, faced extraordinary levels of scrutiny. Simple acts, herbal knowledge, midwifery, or defiance of a husband, could be framed as evidence of moral corruption or alignment with evil. Trials for witchcraft were spectacles of fear, blending legal procedures with theatrical terror. The accused were subjected to tests, public examination, and communal judgment. Conviction often led to death, but the process itself reinforced the omnipresent power of societal norms and the ease with which fear could manipulate behavior. Even when punishment stopped short of execution, the consequences were long-lasting. A woman branded as a gossip or heretic carried the stigma for life. Her social standing, marriage prospects, and influence within the community were diminished. Children and relatives could also bear indirect punishment, experiencing social exclusion or derision due to association. This ripple effect ensured that public humiliation was not an isolated incident. It was a mechanism for broader social control. The lesson was clear. Morality was not just private. It was performative, communal, and inseparable from social survival. Sometimes, authorities employed imaginative variations of punishment, blending fear, spectacle, and moral lesson. Offenders might be forced to parade with a cartwheel on their back, wearing exaggerated symbols of their sin. In other towns, women accused of moral improprieties had to carry heavy, visible markers, buckets of water, weights, or symbolic objects to signal wrongdoing. The physical act was secondary. The display and audience were primary. By linking suffering to visibility, medieval societies transformed punishment into a public narrative, embedding lessons into memory, gossip, and daily life. Every act of humiliation became part of the cultural fabric. Punishments also adapted to reinforce hierarchy. Nobles or clergy might face minor exposure or fines for missteps, while peasants endured harsh, public humiliation. The disparity emphasized class boundaries and reinforced obedience. Moreover, gender played a critical role. Women were consistently punished more severely for breaches of modesty, speech, or perceived insubordination. Medieval communities understood that controlling female behavior maintained order, stability, and male authority. These punishments were not random, they were carefully calibrated instruments of social engineering. Despite the often brutal nature of these methods, medieval authorities understood the psychological underpinnings of shame. They knew that social ostracism could bend behavior without the need for permanent injury. Offenders were displayed, ridiculed, and marked, and communities absorbed the message. Maintain the moral order or face consequences. In effect, morality was not merely written into law. It was etched into everyday life, reinforced through social observation and performance. The emotional weight of shame became as binding as any contract or decree. Interestingly, not all responses were entirely compliant. Some communities and individuals pushed back, mitigating punishment or even challenging the fairness of public shaming. Chroniclers sometimes record moments of protest, crowds that intervened, or neighbors who hid accused women to prevent exposure. Such resistance, however small, reveals that the power of shame was not absolute. It depended on participation. If the community chose to enforce norms, the spectacle succeeded. If they hesitated, the punishment lost its sting. Authority, therefore, relied as much on collective consent as on the devices themselves. In the end, medieval punishments for improper behavior were complex, multi-layered systems of social control. They were part ritual, part theater, part law enforcement. They used fear, visibility, and ridicule to shape behavior, particularly among women. And they remind us that morality, justice, and power have always been intertwined. In the shadow of the pillory, the scold's bridle, and the stocks, we see a world where conformity was enforced not just by law but by the collective gaze of a watching, judging society. Even as the centuries progressed, the echoes of these punishments remained. Chroniclers, legal manuals, and parish records preserve vivid accounts of how communities enforced moral order. Some punishments evolved into more bureaucratic or legalistic forms, yet the essence remained: public acknowledgement, social shame, and gendered control. Women continued to bear the weight of societal judgment, particularly when they stepped beyond prescribed roles. Every act of punishment reinforced a hierarchy of power, demonstrating that morality was inseparable from authority. One particularly insidious aspect of medieval punishment was its symbolic layering. Authorities often incorporated visual metaphors into punitive devices. Chains, iron masks, or wooden contraptions weren't merely functional. They represented the spiritual and moral weight of transgression. Crowds witnessing a scold's bridle or the public flogging of a woman understood that wrongdoing was both a personal failing and a threat to the social fabric. Each spectacle communicated lessons about obedience, silence, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior, all without relying on complex legal argumentation. Some devices blurred the line between education and terror. For example, the ducking stool, often reserved for women accused of scolding or minor theft, was ostensibly a method of correction. Yet it also dramatized control. The accused would be bound to a chair and submerged repeatedly in water, a ritual of shame witnessed by neighbors lining the riverbank. These punishments relied on communal participation. The laughter, jeers, and commentary of onlookers were integral. Social learning occurred not through abstract reasoning but through immersion in a performative drama of consequences. Medieval morality, therefore, was performative and relational. Behavior was evaluated not only by the law but through the eyes of others. In many villages, the mere threat of public humiliation could curb misbehavior more effectively than physical punishment. Women particularly internalized these rules. The fear of gossip, mockery, or forced exposure shaped daily choices, from speech to attire, from social interaction to domestic conduct. Compliance became both self-regulated and community-enforced. In this way, punishment operated not only on bodies but on minds, crafting a society governed by fear, observation, and expectation. Punishments were also deeply intertwined with religion. Clergy often played roles as judges, prosecutors, or moral arbiters. Spiritual guidance and legal authority merged to reinforce societal norms. A woman accused of slander or adultery might face penance imposed by the church alongside public shaming. This combination of spiritual and social sanction heightened the stakes. Wrongdoing was framed as both sinful and socially dangerous, leaving little room for escape. Communities internalized these frameworks, creating a culture where moral deviance was visibly punished and morally instructive. Interestingly, some punishments targeted speech itself. The medieval obsession with controlling gossip, rumor, and verbal dissent reveals a society acutely aware of the power of words. A whispered accusation could escalate into public spectacle. Women, in particular, were policed for their voices, whether through scolds' bridles, public recitation of their crimes, or forced silence in courtrooms and markets. The control of speech was a form of control over influence, authority, and gender roles. By regulating who could speak and what could be spoken, communities maintained hierarchies and reinforced obedience. The psychological dimension of punishment cannot be overstated. Fear, embarrassment, and stigma were instruments as effective as chains and paddles. Scholars note that long after punishment, victims and observers carried its lessons forward. Children learned morality through witnessing consequences. Adults enforced rules both formally and informally. The community itself became an instrument of justice, internalizing norms so deeply that self-policing became routine. Punishment thus operated on multiple levels: legal, social, psychological, and symbolic. Moreover, medieval punishments were deeply performative in ways that resonate even today. The intersection of shame, gender, and spectacle illustrates a broader truth. Societies maintain control through narratives as much as law. By turning improper behavior into public theater, authorities created cautionary tales encoded in collective memory. Women's experiences were particularly marked by this dynamic, reflecting anxieties about female autonomy and influence. Every public punishment became a story, retold through generations as both warning and spectacle, ensuring that moral lessons remained vivid. Even as we study these practices today, it's clear that medieval punishments were less about fairness and more about control. They reveal a society obsessed with order, hierarchy, and conformity. They illuminate the precarious position of women, whose bodies and voices were often the first battlegrounds of moral enforcement. And they remind us that justice has never existed in a vacuum. It is always shaped by culture, fear, and the desire to reinforce authority. In understanding these practices, we gain insight into the mechanisms of power and the enduring human preoccupation with morality. Finally, reflecting on these harsh realities, we see the complexity of medieval justice. It was not merely punitive. It was theatrical, moralistic, and deeply gendered. Punishments for improper behavior functioned as lessons, warnings, and instruments of social control. Women bore the brunt of these systems, yet their stories persist through records, chronicles, and accounts that survive centuries. They speak to resilience, fear, and the delicate balance of power in communities where every glance, word, and action could carry consequences. By examining this history, we illuminate both the cruelty and the social ingenuity of a world long past, reminding us that morality, power, and justice are inseparable, and that the echoes of these practices continue to shape our understanding of human behavior.